Camera with flash: the secret buried beneath southern soil, Celia's story. There's a photograph that survived, barely. It was found in a tin box beneath the floorboards of a plantation house in South Carolina during a renovation in 1998. The workers almost threw it away, but one of them paused. He looked closer at the woman in the frame. She was standing behind the family, beautiful, young, her hands folded in front of her like she was trying to disappear. And in the corner of that photograph, barely visible, was a small grave marker. No name, just a date, 1862. The workers asked the homeowner about it. He said his family didn't talk about her. They never had. Her name was Celia. And what happened to her children is one of the most haunting secrets ever buried beneath southern soil. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is a documented reality that existed in the shadowed margins of American history, repeated across hundreds of plantations, whispered about in kitchens, and hidden in family Bibles. It's about a young woman who was called beautiful by everyone who saw her, who bore children that looked like the master's legitimate heirs, and who watched those children vanish one by one. Some died, some were sold, and some simply disappeared into the woods behind the house, their graves unmarked, their existence erased. Celia was born around 1835 on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. By the time she was 14, she'd been moved into the main house. The mistress wanted her close, not because she trusted her, but because she wanted to watch her. Celia was light-skinned, with soft features and eyes that people said looked almost gray in certain light. In the hierarchy of enslavement, this made her valuable, and it made her vulnerable in ways that no law would ever protect. The master's name was Robert Ashford. He was 43 years old when Celia turned 15. He had a wife, Margaret, and 3 legitimate children. He attended church every Sunday. He read from the Bible at dinner. And at night, when the house went quiet, he would walk down the narrow hallway to the small room where Celia slept. There are no love letters, no diary entries describing romance, because this wasn't love. This was ownership. Celia had no choice. She couldn't refuse. She couldn't run. And when she became pregnant at 16, the entire household pretended not to notice. Margaret Ashford knew. The other enslaved women knew. The children knew. But no one spoke about it, because to speak about it would be to acknowledge a truth that threatened the very foundation of their world. Celia gave birth to her first child in the spring of 1851. A girl, light-skinned like her mother, with Robert's nose, his chin. The resemblance was undeniable. Margaret saw it immediately, and the child was named Sarah, though she was never called that in the house. The enslaved women called her, the baby. Margaret called her nothing at all. She wouldn't look at her. When Celia carried the infant through the house, Margaret would turn her head, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the arms of her chair until her knuckles went white. Robert never acknowledged the child as his, not publicly, but he gave Celia small privileges. She no longer worked in the fields. She was kept in the house, close to him, her duties light compared to the others. And this created a rift. The other enslaved people resented her. They thought she had it easy. They didn't see the nights. They didn't hear what happened behind closed doors. They only saw the surface, the pretty girl who didn't pick cotton, the girl who ate better food, the girl who seemed untouchable. But Celia wasn't untouchable. She was trapped. And Sarah, her daughter, was a living reminder of that trap. The child grew quickly. By the time she was 2 years old, she was walking, talking, laughing. She had Robert's smile. And that smile made Margaret Ashford's blood boil, because every time she saw that child, she saw her husband's betrayal. She saw her own humiliation. And she saw a future where this girl might one day claim something that didn't belong to her. So Margaret made a decision. One morning in 1853, Celia awoke to find Sarah gone. The child's blanket was still warm. Her small shoes were still by the bed, but Sarah was nowhere in the house. Celia searched frantically, calling her name, begging the other women if they'd seen her. No one had, or no one would say. Celia found Robert in his study. She stood in the doorway, trembling, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked him where Sarah was. He didn't look up from his papers. He told her the child had been sent away, that it was for the best, that she would be cared for. Celia asked where. He told her it didn't matter. And then he told her to go back to her work. She never saw Sarah again. There are records, plantation ledgers, bills of sale, and buried in those documents is a single line dated April 18, 1853, one female child, approximately 2 years, sold to an estate in Georgia. No name, no details, just a transaction. Sarah had been sold, torn from her mother's arms while she slept, sent hundreds of miles away to a place Celia would never be able to reach. And the worst part? It was legal. It was normal. It happened every single day. Celia didn't speak for weeks after that. The other women said she moved through the house like a ghost. She did her work. She obeyed orders. But something inside her had broken. And Margaret noticed. Margaret, who had orchestrated the entire thing, watched Celia's grief with cold satisfaction, because in her mind she had won. She had removed the evidence. The living, breathing reminder of her husband's sin was gone. But Robert didn't stop. 6 months later, Celia was pregnant again. This time, she tried to hide it. She wrapped her stomach in cloth. She wore loose dresses. She worked harder, hoping that maybe the labor would end the pregnancy before it became visible. But by January of 1854, there was no hiding it anymore. And this time, Margaret didn't wait. She told Robert that if he brought another bastard child into her house, she would leave. She would go back to her family in Charleston. She would take the children. She would ruin him. So Robert made Celia a promise. He told her this child would be different. He told her no one would take this one. He told her she could keep it. And Celia, desperate and broken, believed him. She gave birth in March of 1854, a boy this time. She named him Thomas after her own father, a man she barely remembered. Thomas was small but healthy. He had Robert's eyes. And for a few months, Celia allowed herself to hope. She held him close. She sang to him. She imagined a future where maybe somehow he might be free. But that future never came. Because on a cold morning in November, Thomas stopped breathing. He was 8 months old. Celia woke to find him still and silent in her arms. There was no warning, no illness. He had been fine the night before, but now he was gone. The doctor who examined Thomas said it was natural causes. Infant mortality was common, he explained. It happened all the time, especially among the enslaved population. Poor nutrition, he suggested. Weak constitution. Nothing unusual. He wrote it in his log and left within the hour. But Celia knew. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. But she knew there was a cup of milk by Thomas's bedside that morning. Milk that Margaret Ashford herself had brought the night before. Margaret, who never entered the quarters. Margaret, who had never shown a moment of kindness to Celia or her children. Margaret, who had smiled strangely when she handed Celia that cup and told her to make sure the baby drank it all. Celia buried Thomas behind the main house, near the vegetable garden. There was no funeral, no marker. Robert didn't attend, he was in town that day conducting business. When he returned that evening, Celia tried to tell him what she suspected. She tried to explain about the milk, about Margaret's visit, about the timing. He struck her across the face. He told her she was hysterical. He told her she was inventing stories to ease her own guilt. And then he told her if she ever accused his wife of anything again, he would sell her south to the sugar fields where women didn't last more than a few years. So Celia stayed silent. The months passed, and Robert came to her room again. By 1855, Celia was pregnant for the third time. She was 20 years old. She had already lost 2 children, and this time she didn't tell anyone. She hid the pregnancy for as long as she could. She stopped eating in front of others. She worked bent over, her body concealed. She planned to give birth in secret, to hide the child somewhere, anywhere Margaret couldn't reach. But you can't hide a baby forever. In June of 1855, Celia went into labor. It was fast, violent. She delivered alone in the quarters, biting down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming, another girl. This one she named nothing at all, because to name something is to claim it. And Celia knew she couldn't protect what she claimed. She kept the infant hidden for 3 days. She wrapped her in rags, tucked her into a wooden crate, brought her scraps of food to keep her milk flowing. But on the 4th day, Margaret found them. She was doing an inspection of the quarters, something she rarely did. And she heard the baby cry. Margaret didn't say a word. She just looked at Celia, and Celia saw it in her eyes, the same cold decision she'd seen before. That night, Celia didn't sleep. She held her daughter close, whispering promises she knew she couldn't keep. And when morning came, the baby was gone, just like Sarah, just like Thomas. But this time, there was no record of sale, no ledger entry, no bill. The child simply ceased to exist. Celia started asking questions, quietly at first. She asked the other enslaved women if they'd seen anything, if they'd heard a baby crying, if they knew where Margaret had taken her. Most of them looked away. They pitied her, but they couldn't help her. To help her was to risk their own lives, their own children. One woman, an older cook named Ruth, pulled Celia aside one evening. She told her to stop asking. She told her there were rumors about what happened to children like hers, children who looked too much like the master, children who threatened the inheritance of the legitimate heirs. Ruth said some were sold in the dead of night. Some were given to traveling traders who asked no questions. And some, she whispered, never left the property at all. She told Celia about a spot in the woods, past the old tobacco barn, where the ground was soft and the trees grew strange. She said people had seen Margaret walking there at dawn, her hands dirty, her face blank. She said no one went there anymore, not even to hunt. Celia wanted to go look, but Robert watched her now. Ever since the 3rd child disappeared, he kept her closer. He moved her into a room attached to the main house, right next to the kitchen. He said it was for her own safety. But Celia knew the truth. He was making sure she couldn't run, making sure she couldn't talk, making sure she stayed exactly where he wanted her. And then she got pregnant again. 1856, her 4th child. She was 21 years old, and she looked 40. Her hair had started to gray. Her hands shook. The other women said she'd stopped speaking except when spoken to. She moved through her days like someone underwater, slow and distant, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. This pregnancy was different. Celia was sick constantly. She couldn't keep food down. Her body was giving out, and part of her welcomed it, because if she died, this would finally end. But she didn't die. In February of 1857, she gave birth to twin boys, both healthy, both unmistakably Robert's children. They had his auburn hair, his sharp features, his long fingers. Margaret saw them and laughed. It was a sound Celia would never forget, high and cold and completely empty of humor. Margaret looked at those 2 babies and said out loud in front of everyone, "Well, aren't we prolific?" And then she walked away. The twins lived for 6 weeks. They slept in a small cradle near Celia's bed. She barely slept herself, terrified that if she closed her eyes, they would be gone when she woke. She watched them constantly. She barely ate. She made Ruth taste any food before she touched it. But it didn't matter. One morning, both boys were dead. No warning, no struggle. Just two small bodies, cold and still, lying side by side. The doctor came again. Same conclusion, natural causes. Happens all the time. Tragic, but not unusual. He was gone before noon. Celia carried those boys into the woods herself, to the place Ruth had told her about. And she found what she'd been afraid to find. Small mounds. 7 of them. Some old, covered in moss. Some newer. Fresh dirt. No markers. No names. Just silence. Celia dug 2 more graves that day. She used her bare hands. The soil was soft, just like Ruth had said. Soft because it had been turned before. Again and again. She laid her sons in the ground and covered them without prayer, because what God would allow this? What God would let children be buried in secret, their lives erased before they even began? She stayed there until dark, sitting between the graves, her dress covered in dirt, her mind somewhere far away. When she finally returned to the house, Robert was waiting. He asked where she'd been. She didn't answer. He asked again, louder this time. She looked at him with eyes that held nothing. No fear, no hope, no grief, just emptiness. And for the first time in his life, Robert Ashford felt afraid of someone he owned. Celia didn't speak for months after that. The household adjusted. Margaret seemed pleased. The tension that had filled the house for years had finally lifted. With no more children to threaten her, no more living evidence of Robert's infidelity, Margaret could pretend none of it had ever happened. She redecorated. She hosted parties. She smiled at church and accepted compliments on her beautiful home and her well-mannered children. But Celia was still there. A ghost in the corner, serving meals, cleaning rooms, existing but not living. And Robert, despite everything, still came to her room. Even after all she'd lost, even after the graves in the woods, he still believed he had the right. It was 1858 when something inside Celia finally snapped. Robert came to her room one night in late September. He'd been drinking. He was rougher than usual, more demanding. And when he was done, when he started to leave, Celia spoke for the first time in over a year. She asked him a single question: "Where are my children?" Robert stopped. He turned slowly. He told her they were gone, that she needed to forget about them, that this was her life now, and she needed to accept it. And Celia, this woman who had been silent for so long, who had buried her children in unmarked graves and swallowed her screams, finally said the words she'd been holding inside. "Your wife killed them." Robert's face went white, then red. He told her she was insane, that she was ungrateful, that he'd given her a better life than she deserved, and this was how she repaid him. He raised his hand to strike her. But this time, Celia didn't flinch. She just stared at him. And in that stare was something that made him lower his hand and back toward the door. He left. And the next morning, Celia was gone. She had run. In the middle of the night, she'd taken nothing but the clothes on her back and disappeared into the darkness. The dogs were sent after her. Slave catchers were hired. Notices were posted in 3 counties, but Celia had vanished. Some said she'd made it north. Others said she'd drowned herself in the river. A few whispered that she'd gone back to those graves in the woods and simply laid down among them, choosing to be with her children rather than live another day in that house. The truth is, no one knows what happened to Celia. There's no record of her capture, no death certificate, no sale. She simply ceased to exist in the official record after September of 1858, as if she'd never been born at all. Robert Ashford died in 1873. He was 63 years old. By then, the war had ended. Slavery was abolished. The plantation had fallen into disrepair. Margaret had died 2 years earlier, and their legitimate children had moved north, wanting nothing to do with the land or its history. Robert died alone in that big house, surrounded by ghosts he refused to acknowledge. When the property was sold, the new owners found things, letters hidden in floorboards, a journal Margaret had kept, though most pages had been torn out. And in the back of that journal, in handwriting that didn't match the rest, was a list of names: Sarah, Thomas, 2 unnamed entries, and then the twins, Samuel and James. Names Celia had probably whispered to them in the brief weeks they lived, names that were never spoken aloud in that house. The new owners also found the graves, all 9 of them, 7 small ones in the woods where Celia had buried her children, and 2 larger ones closer to the main house that no one could explain. The county came and exhumed them. No identification was possible. The bodies were too old, too deteriorated. They were reburied in the local cemetery in a section reserved for unknown persons. No names, no dates, just a single marker that read, "Children of the Ashford Estate." But here's what haunts me most about this story. It's not unique. Celia wasn't the only one. Every plantation in the South had women like her, beautiful, light-skinned, trapped in the houses of men who owned them. And every one of those plantations had graves, unmarked, hidden, forgotten children who were born into impossible situations and disappeared before they could threaten the social order that white families had built their wealth upon. There are descendants alive today who don't know this part of their history. White families with last names like Ashford living in nice houses, completely unaware that their great-great-grandfather fathered children he never claimed. Children who died or were sold or simply vanished. And there are black families with DNA that connects them to those same white families, carrying the genetic proof of what happened even when the documents were destroyed. In 1998, when that photograph was found, historians tried to trace Celia's story. They found the ledgers. They found Margaret's journal. They found court records showing Robert Ashford had been sued twice by neighboring plantation owners over interference with property, which was code for exactly what you think it means. But they never found Celia. No grave, no record of her after 1858. She disappeared as completely as her children had. Some historians believe she made it north and lived under a different name. There are whispers of a woman matching her description who appeared in Philadelphia in 1859 working as a seamstress who would never speak about her past. But there's no proof, just stories, just possibilities. What we do know is this. Those children existed. They were born. They lived. They died or were taken. And then they were erased. Not by accident, not by natural causes, but by deliberate, systematic silence, because their existence was inconvenient, because they threatened the legitimacy of white heirs, because they were evidence of crimes that society refused to call crimes. The house still stands. It's a bed and breakfast now. People stay there, take pictures, post about the beautiful antebellum architecture, and sometimes guests report strange things: a woman's voice singing lullabies in empty rooms, the sound of a baby crying in the middle of the night, the feeling of being watched when walking near the woods behind the property. The owners say it's nonsense, but they also admit they don't go into those woods, and they don't talk about the graves. And when guests ask about the history of enslaved people on the property, they give vague answers and change the subject quickly, because some stories are too dark to sell. Some truths are too uncomfortable to display on a historical plaque. And some graves are meant to stay unmarked, hidden beneath beautiful trees and polite silence, holding secrets that certain families would prefer stayed buried. But Celia's children were real. They had names. They had faces. They had Robert Ashford's eyes and his chin and his hair. And somewhere in archives and DNA databases and family trees that people are only now beginning to trace, the truth is still waiting, still trying to be heard, still refusing to stay silent. If you made it this far, you've witnessed something most people will never have the courage to face: the real cost of what was called civilization, the real price of what was called order. This isn't ancient history. This was someone's great-great-grandmother, someone's buried bloodline, someone's family secret that was never supposed to see daylight.